Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I'm going to start in the name of God. In Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. To proceed, brothers and sisters in humanity, peace be with you. Today I'm going to be talking about Islam's influence in the West. The reason I'm talking about this because it's very important to see that Islam is not just an alien tradition and is the boogeyman or is something different and not part of our civilization or culture. In actual fact, we're going to realize that Islam has had an unprecedented impact and influence on Western civilization, on key milestones and key pillars of our Western civilization. And it's important to discuss this because it allows us then to remove the emotional and historical filters that prevent us from understanding a world tradition and a worldview like the Islamic worldview. So I'm going to be talking about three things: scientific progress, presumption of innocence, and tolerance. Let's go straight to scientific progress. Now, it's well known in Western academic history that essentially Islam has had an unprecedented impact and influence on science and progress. Now, we know this, for example, when we look into Islamic Spain. When Muslims took over Islamic Spain, they created what you would call a convivencia. A convivencia basically means a coexistence. And there was a coexistence between Jews, Christians, Muslims, and other peoples. And there was the correct, tranquil environment that facilitated people looking into the interconnecting principles of nature. And this wasn't a historical accident. It's directly as a result of the Islamic social political tradition. For example, the Quran is very focused on justice and tranquility. It says, be just even if against your own selves. Do not let the hatred of others make you swerve from justice. Be just what's closer to your duty. God says 3 times in the Quran, in the book of the Muslims, God loves the just. The Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, said, whoever harms a non-Muslim under our protection is equivalent of harming the Prophet himself. Also, we know that the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, said, be conscious of oppression and injustice, for it's going to be darkness on the day of judgment. The Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, also said, there is no harming and no reciprocating of harm. And we have an array and a myriad of Quranic and prophetic traditions that are social political in nature and were implemented in Islamic Spain and created that needed environment, that tranquil environment, so human beings, Muslim and non-Muslim, could look into the interconnecting principles of nature. And this is exactly what happened. This is why we had works on astronomy, on geology, on science, on mathematics, on physics, on most of the sciences, and including literature like prose and poetry. And this facilitated the Renaissance and the scientific revolution in the West. Professor Thomas Arnold, who's a historian and an Arabist, what did he say? He said something very profound. He said, if it wasn't for Muslim Spain, we wouldn't have the scientific revolution. We wouldn't have the Renaissance. And this is actually a known fact in Western academic circles. For example, we have the likes of Maria Rosa-Menocal, who is an expert in early history, early Islamic history. She basically says that Europe has a huge debt to Islam concerning the revival of the sciences. We have the likes of Robert Ruffo in The Making of Humanity. He also discusses that, we can't be unjust anymore to the Arabs, to the Muslims, because we owe them a lot because they revived the sciences and progressed what the Greeks first developed conceptually, and then practically the Muslims took it forward. So it's something very amazing what Islam did, because it wasn't just a historical accident. It's because of that tranquil environment that was created by the social political principles in the Quran and the prophetic traditions. This is no wonder that Adam Smith, the 18th century founder of modern capitalism, he said that the empire of the caliphs, meaning the empire of the Muslims, the caliphate, was the first state in which that degree of tranquility was needed and implemented so people could look into the interconnecting principles of nature. And this is phenomenal. And this tranquility came from the Quranic principles and from the prophetic traditions, basically from the Islamic teachings. Interestingly, the artistic critic, the French artistic critic, Jean-Jacques Lévesque, he spoke about how when Muslims took over other nations in history, that they didn't do so to create carnage, but they did so because they wanted to look into the horizons, because the Quran tells them to look into the horizons. The Quran says that we will show our signs and evidences in the horizons and in themselves until they know that this is the truth. So the Muslims were motivated by implementing justice and harmony and the peace of Islam around the world. But furthermore, they were motivated by looking at the interconnecting principles of nature and looking into the horizons. So we see there's a direct impact of Islam and Islamic principles to things like scientific progress and the scientific renaissance and the scientific revolution in Europe. So basically, when we see an iPhone or an iPad or a computer screen or a BlackBerry, or whatever the case may be, these things are almost as a result of the Islamic tradition, because of the algorithm. The algorithm was developed by the Muslims, and that only could happen if we had that tranquil environment based upon the Islamic principles to facilitate and invoke learning. So let's go to the second point, which is the presumption of innocence. We know there's many theories in history on how we develop the presumption of innocence, but European conception of the presumption of innocence is known to have come from, or started to have come from, King Louis IX. And King Louis IX traveled to the east and met a monk, and this is according to his chronicler. And this monk studied the Bible and studied the Quran, which is the book of the Muslims. And he was advising the king, if you want justice like these peoples, meaning the Muslims, then you have to follow what they're doing. You have to follow their tradition. And he gave word for word almost a prophetic tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, about justice. And he taught that to King Louis IX. And King Louis IX went back to Europe and he facilitated the conception of the presumption of innocence. Now, this can be found in the academic essay that was published in 1980, I believe, by Marcel Boissard, and it's called On the Probable Influence of Islam on the Presumption of Innocence. So it shows that Islam had a direct effect concerning a very key legal principle in our tradition, which is the presumption of innocence. And interestingly, before that time, the only way people could be found innocent was if, when they were burnt alive, they survived. Or they will fight a duel, and if they won, it means they were innocent. So we see Islam has had a profound effect even on things like the presumption of innocence. The next and final point to show how Islam has heavily influenced the West and is part of our culture and civilization is actually tolerance. Now we know tolerance is throughout the Quran and the prophetic traditions. We know the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, he spoke at length concerning tolerance, as well as the Quran. It teaches to overlook and forgive. Also, it tells us that we were created from a single entity and we were created into different tribes and nations, that we should know one another, to know what makes us distinct. And by understanding what makes us distinct, then we could come together on these differences, because it is the very differences that cause the fear and anxiety. So if we learn about these differences, as the Quran is saying, know what makes you distinct, then we'll get to know one another and therefore facilitate something that's very positive. Also, we have to understand that our classical scholarship, based upon the Quran, the prophetic traditions, developed a model of tolerance and even a model for minorities. For example, the classical scholar Imam Qarafi, he states very key obligations that the Muslims have to the minorities if they live under an Islamic state or Muslim governance. And he says that you have to basically take care of their poor, feed them, provide clothing for them, ensure they are mentally healthy, physically healthy, and also if they are harmed, if Muslims are harmed by non-Muslims, to overlook and forgive. And it's something very special in our tradition, and we take pride of it. We take pride in it, having this tolerance and justice in Islam. And I would argue that Islam actually facilitated the European conception of tolerance, for instance. Now, if we look at Christopher Walker's book, Islam in the West, something is quite amazing. We read the influence of John Locke. John Locke was the post-Enlightenment thinker, and he was a thinker that was influenced, as he says in his own writings, by one man. And this man, he says, was Edward Pocock. And Edward Pocock was the first Orientalist at Oxford University, and he traveled to the East. And I would even argue he took manuscripts concerning tolerance in Arabic from the Islamic tradition and learned about how Islam facilitated the peaceful coexistence between different nations, just like we had in Spain, the convivencia, the coexistence. And he took it back and he was teaching people Islamic studies. And John Locke was heavily influenced by Edward Pocock. And John Locke, we know, is responsible for writing treatises on tolerance. He wrote a book called On Civil Governance, and his teachings influenced the founding fathers of America. So what is really interesting here is that when we read the works of John Locke, for example, when we read the works on civil governance, he describes the relationship between the sultan, the king, the governor, and those governed as a vicegerency. Now, to translate vicegerency in the Arabic language is simple. It's khilafa, which means the caliphate. So he was almost taking ideas from the Islamic political tradition about governance and about tolerance and putting it in his works that influenced Europe and influenced America. So this is quite amazing that Islam even had an influence on a key post-Enlightenment thinker like John Locke. There's much more. There's so much more to write about concerning Islamic history and Islamic values and how it changed the world and influenced the West. But these three things would suffice to help us remove the historical and emotional filters that prevent us from understanding Islam as part of our own civilization and our own culture. Thank you very much for listening. Peace be with you.
Da 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 da.